A single sentence from the White House this month sums up the whole standoff. The ceasefire, as far as the president is concerned, is over. Then, less than 24 hours later, the same president says there's no long-term military action coming. That whiplash, furious one day, restrained the next, is the entire story of what's happening around the Strait of Hormuz right now. Welcome back. I fly for a living. I've spent years reading tactical situations for a paycheck. And today we're going to slow this whole thing down and actually explain what's happening in the waters between Iran and Oman, why one narrow channel keeps threatening to reignite an entire war, and why an island most people couldn't find on a map a year ago has become the single most watched patch of real estate in the Middle East. Stick with me, because the surface-level headlines, US and Iran back at war, ceasefire collapses, don't actually capture what's going on underneath. This is a story about leverage, about a body of water that carries a fifth of the planet's oil, and about two sides that fought each other to a standstill in the spring, signed a piece of paper, and now can't agree on what that paper actually means. Let's start with basic geography, because it explains almost everything else. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, with shipping lanes on each side even tighter than that. Iran sits on one shore, Oman sits on the other, and squeezed through that gap day after day is roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil consumption, along with a massive share of global liquefied natural gas. There is no realistic detour. Tankers that would normally take a day to clear the strait would need weeks to reroute around the southern tip of Africa, and even then, insurance costs and shipping capacity couldn't absorb that kind of permanent rerouting. That's what makes Hormuz different from almost any other flashpoint in modern geopolitics. It isn't a symbolic prize. It's a physical bottleneck that the global economy has no substitute for. When Iran effectively shut it down back at the end of February, the ripple effects hit fuel prices in Asia within days, not weeks. Refineries in places that had nothing to do with the underlying dispute were suddenly scrambling for alternate crude supplies. This is the part that a lot of casual news coverage skips past. This conflict isn't confined to the Gulf. Everyone who buys gasoline anywhere on the planet has some stake in how this plays out, whether they realize it or not. Now overlay Kharg Island onto that picture. It's a small island off Iran's own coast, and it happens to be the single point through which roughly 9/10 of Iran's crude exports flow. Offshore fields pipe crude underwater to loading terminals on the island, tankers pull up, and the oil leaves for buyers around the world, China chief among them. So you've got two choke points layered on top of each other, the strait itself, which is Iran's leverage over everyone else's oil, and Kharg Island, which is the rest of the world's leverage over Iran's oil revenue. Understanding that two-way pressure point is the key to understanding literally everything that's happened since February. This didn't start with a fight over a shipping lane. It started at the end of February, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated bombing campaign against Iran that, within days, had killed Iran's supreme leader along with a long list of senior officials and destroyed a significant chunk of the country's military infrastructure. Iran responded the way you'd expect a wounded state to respond. Missiles and drones aimed at Israel, at American bases scattered across the region, and at US-aligned governments nearby. And critically, Iran also moved to seal off the Strait of Hormuz, both as retaliation and as its most powerful remaining bargaining chip. For roughly 5 weeks, that's essentially what the war looked like. Strikes, counterstrikes, a genuinely closed strait, and fuel shortages spreading across parts of Asia that had never expected to be touched by a Middle Eastern conflict. Then, in early April, exhaustion and economic pressure on both sides finally produced a ceasefire, brokered with help from Pakistan. The core bargain was straightforward on paper. The bombing stops, and in exchange, Iran allows the safe, unhindered passage of commercial shipping back through the strait. Here's the problem, and it's the problem driving literally every headline since. The written agreement never nailed down exactly who controls the strait, or exactly what safe passage means in practice. It talks about Iran making arrangements for commercial vessels and coordinating with Oman on the long-term administration of the waterway. Language vague enough that both sides have spent the following months interpreting it completely differently. Washington reads it as, the strait is now open, full stop, no fees, no Iranian gatekeeping. Tehran reads it as an opening to assert some level of ongoing authority over a waterway. It's controlled the northern shore for its entire history, including, reportedly, exploring the idea of charging tolls to ships that pass through. That ambiguity is why the ceasefire has felt less like peace and more like an extended pause between rounds. Traffic through the strait slowed to a fraction of normal levels for stretches of the spring and summer. Iran's navy has, at different points, declared the strait effectively closed, only for Iran's own foreign ministry to insist hours later that shipping was moving normally, a level of internal contradiction that tells you the Iranian government itself hasn't fully settled on a single strategy here. Now let's bring Kharg Island back into the picture, because its story runs in parallel to the Strait crisis and explains the restraint everyone keeps talking about. In mid-March, before the ceasefire, U.S. Central Command carried out a large precision raid against the island, more than 90 separate military targets in a single night. Naval mine storage sites, missile bunkers, air defense positions, a chunk of the base infrastructure Iran had built up there. Iran's own state media confirmed the strikes and described the damage as severe. And yet, in the same breath, CENTCOM's own public statement made a point of saying the oil infrastructure itself had been preserved. That's not an accident of imprecise bombing. Hitting 90-plus targets and somehow missing every single oil facility only happens if avoiding it was the actual plan from the start. Then, after the ceasefire cracked under the weight of the Hormuz dispute, the U.S. hit the island again in April and once more in early July when Iran fired on commercial vessels near the strait. Each time the pattern repeated. Real damage to military assets, zero deliberate damage to the terminal that actually generates Iran's oil income. Satellite imagery reviewed after these strikes has consistently shown tankers still docked and loading at Kharg within days, sometimes even hours. Why the restraint, given how furious the rhetoric gets in between? Because destroying that terminal outright wouldn't just hurt Iran, it would yank a meaningful slice of global oil supply off the market overnight. And the country buying the largest share of that oil isn't a U.S. adversary in isolation. It's a huge chunk of Asia's energy supply chain, China most of all. Every time tensions over Kharg spike, oil markets feel it immediately. Benchmark crude prices have jumped sharply within a single trading day purely off rhetoric, before a single additional barrel was actually taken offline. Actually finishing the job would send that shock much further, and the pain wouldn't stay contained to Tehran. It would show up at filling stations from Manila to Milwaukee within a couple of weeks. That's the strange logic holding this particular trigger back. It's not mercy, it's mutually assured economic damage. Strikes are one thing, but reporting throughout the spring made clear that Washington has seriously discussed something far more dramatic. Actually landing troops and taking physical control of Kharg Island, not to destroy it, but to hold it hostage as leverage over the entire Hormuz standoff. From a pure capability standpoint, this isn't far-fetched. Kharg is small, and U.S. Marine expeditionary units, purpose-built for exactly this kind of rapid amphibious raid, along with Army airborne assets, have been forward-positioned in the region for months, consistent with this option, staying live rather than theoretical. Retired flag officers who've spoken publicly about it generally agree on one thing: taking the island wouldn't be the hard part. A well-resourced modern expeditionary force could likely secure it in a matter of hours, given how lightly it's actually garrisoned, relative to what the U.S. could throw at it. Holding it is where the plan gets genuinely dangerous. Intelligence reporting throughout the spring described Iran actively fortifying the island in anticipation of exactly this scenario, moving in additional troops, shoulder-fired air defense systems, and other equipment specifically meant to make an American occupation costly and grinding rather than clean. Small island garrisons have a rough historical track record, and it's almost never the initial landing that produces the casualties. It's the weeks afterward, defending an exposed position against an adversary that knows the terrain and has had time to prepare. One especially unsettling wrinkle that's come up in intelligence assessments: if Iran ever concluded the island was permanently lost, its most rational move might not be trying to retake it. It might be destroying the oil infrastructure itself, since at that point there'd be nothing left to protect. In other words, the exact asset the seizure plan is meant to preserve could become the first thing Iran torches once it decides it has nothing left to lose. It's also worth noting that not everyone in the region wants Washington to go anywhere near that option. Several Gulf governments have reportedly pushed back on the idea privately, worried that an occupation would trigger serious American casualties and draw Iranian retaliation onto their own infrastructure, which is the last thing any of them want while they're trying to get regional trade and oil markets back to something resembling normal. Away from the big strategic questions about seizing islands, there's a quieter, more mechanical layer to this conflict: how the U.S. is actually enforcing pressure on Iranian oil shipments in the meantime. After Washington reimposed sanctions and something close to a naval blockade following the July flare-up, U.S. forces intercepted a tanker that was reportedly attempting to reach Kharg Island despite repeated warnings. Rather than sinking the vessel, American aircraft fired precision munitions specifically into the ship's smokestack, disabling its propulsion without harming the crew or destroying the ship outright. It's a surgical, almost restrained way to enforce a blockade. Cripple the ability to move, not the vessel or the people on it. That single incident tells you a lot about how this entire conflict has actually been conducted at the operational level, even while the public rhetoric on both sides sounds maximalist. There's a running theme here: hit hard enough to make the point, stop well short of the kind of destruction that would be politically and economically impossible to walk back later. Whether that discipline holds if this drags into another year, with both governments under mounting domestic pressure to just end it decisively one way or another, is genuinely unclear. One thing this conflict makes obvious is that the U.S. and its allies isn't one voice with one strategy. Israeli opposition figures have publicly argued Washington's approach is too cautious, insisting that only the full destruction of Iran's oil industry on Kharg would actually cripple the regime for good, a notably more aggressive position than anything the Trump administration has actually carried out. Meanwhile, Gulf states, Oman especially, have positioned themselves as reluctant mediators trying to keep the whole thing from spiraling again, sometimes finding themselves on the receiving end of undiplomatic threats from Washington, despite being the very back channel the White House needs to keep talks alive. At one point, comments aimed at Oman over the toll question had to be walked back within a day, after Oman's own foreign ministry pushed back and reaffirmed that talks were still making real progress. On the Iranian side, you see something similar: public defiance and closure declarations from military officials, followed within hours by the foreign ministry insisting shipping is moving normally. That's not necessarily coordinated messaging. It may be a genuine internal disagreement about how far to push the leverage Iran still has left, between hardliners who want to keep squeezing the strait and a government that knows how much economic damage a fully collapsed ceasefire would do to Iran itself. Step back from the tactical details for a second, because there's a broader lesson in this that's easy to miss if you're only following the strike-by-strike headlines. This is fundamentally an economic war being fought with military tools. Iran's only meaningful leverage against a much stronger military opponent is its ability to threaten global energy supply. The United States' only meaningful leverage against a regime with nothing left to lose is threatening the single asset that funds its government. Neither side can fully use its biggest weapon without inflicting serious damage on itself and on markets far outside the region. That mutual hostage situation is exactly why you keep seeing this pattern of loud threats followed by careful, limited follow-through, because genuinely maximal action from either side would be an act of self-harm on a global scale, not just a regional one. So here's my honest read, and I want to be upfront that this next part is analysis, not settled fact. I think the most probable near-term path is more of the same holding pattern: periodic strikes on Kharg's military infrastructure, whenever Iran tests the strait again, continued naval interception of individual tankers rather than a blanket blockade, and the seizure option staying exactly where it's been for months. Fully planned, forces in position, but not actually pulled off the shelf. Genuine, full-scale escalation in either direction would require something to break the current cost-benefit math on one side or the other: a lethal attack on American forces tied directly to Kharg, a much bloodier Iranian strike on regional shipping, or a political moment in Washington where ending things decisively suddenly outweighs the risk of a messy occupation. The one thing I'd watch most closely going forward isn't the next round of strikes. It's whether that ceasefire's language around the strait ever actually gets nailed down into something unambiguous. Right now, both governments are operating off a document that lets them each claim they're following it while doing almost opposite things. That kind of deliberate ambiguity can hold for a surprisingly long time. It can also unravel in a single bad week.